Okay, we have a new pope, Pope Leo, which means that Chicago has produced a pope before it has produced a 4,000-yard passer. But given the fact that Pope Leo took the name Leo, it does raise some questions in my mind about describing the first Leo, the Great, Pope Leo I, and in fact the first pope to be given the title the Great. He's one of the doctors of the church, and he's a story worth knowing. So I want to tell that story. Pope Leo I, later known as Leo the Great, was born around the year 400 AD in Tuscany, amid the waning days of the Western Roman Empire. This period was marked by political instability, economic deterioration, and repeated invasions, most notably the sack of Rome in 410. As imperial authority crumbled, the church began to rise in prominence, offering a new form of stability and leadership. Little is recorded of Leo's early days. However, his later accomplishments suggest he had a solid education in both classical and theological disciplines. He's just really good. His writing is very crisp, very clear, and that doesn't come by accident. And by the late 430s, Leo had become a deacon in Rome under Pope Celestine I. In this role, he managed the church's finances. That's a big role in Rome, to be a deacon. And he supervised property, and he coordinated aid for the poor and the clergy. Pope Benedict will later say that it is actually Leo later, with an eye to the helping of the poor, who makes it that for Catholics on fasting days, the eye ought to be not to just simply fasting, but to giving away the food or the money you would have spent on food anyway to the poor. That is, according to Benedict, an invention of Leo's. So he had an eye on, you might say, the administration of Rome, but he also engaged in doctrinal controversies, especially those debates on the nature of Christ, which we'll get to in a minute. Leo would have been involved in writing and sending letters around the world discussing these matters. And as a deacon, Leo set himself apart mostly through his administrative excellence. Now, to some, that doesn't sound very interesting, but for someone like Leo, it's very important, and for Rome, it is also very important in this day. So Leo enforced clerical discipline, and he upheld ethics and doctrinal standards among the clergy. The number one thing he seems to have been known for, which is very interesting in the light of the new Pope Leo, is the original Leo was known for his skill in mediation, both in ecclesiastical and in civil matters. And he got a lot of respect for this. His ability to bring together both sides and being very clear was a hallmark of his papacy. And his administrative skills were actually put to the test in 440 when he was dispatched to Gaul to mediate a dispute between two Roman generals. There was a rivalry, and it threatened the fragile peace of the region. And Leo successfully intervened, not only helping preserve the stability of the time, but it also showed the church's expanded role in secular matters. And while Leo was in Gaul, the Pope died. And on September 29, 440, Leo was unanimously elected as the successor, a testament to his reputation for wisdom, fairness, and integrity. As the pontiff, Leo regarded the papacy, of course, as a divine office. But Leo takes this a bit further, as we'll see, since he will use the papacy not only to preserve church unity and doctrinal purity, but also in an increasing number of secular issues. For Leo, Rome's authority was essential, and his leadership was to combine theological skill with a real strong hand in practical governance. So he often gets credit for his thinking, for his writing, but it was his administrative skill that was just as good, his ability to kind of keep everyone together in a day and age when communication was mostly done by letters, very little face-to-face. Holding all of that together would be a hallmark of Leo's papacy. One of the most defining episodes of Leo's pontificate, and a milestone in early medieval history, is his legendary confrontation with Attila the Hun in 452 AD. That, along with the subsequent sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455 AD, reveals not only the vulnerability of the Western Roman Empire, but also the emerging role of the papacy as both spiritual authority and temporal protector. These events are pretty long revered and often mythologized, but they do capture Leo's legacy as a mediator, as a defender of the faith, and as a stabilizing force in an age of crisis. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire, of course, was disintegrating. Civil authority had fractured, and all of the economic systems of the West were in collapse. And those once formidable borders of the empire were now pretty porous. Barbarian invasions, once isolated and rare, had become pretty persistent, and they were very ruinous to Rome. Chief among these threats were the Huns. Originating from Central Asia and renowned for their ferocity, the Huns under Attila had forged a dominion extending from the Ural River to the Danube. And by the 450s, Attila becomes known as the Scourge of God, just a little symbol of the terror that he was having on those in Europe. So in 452, Attila led his army into Italy, devastating cities such as Padua and Milan. But his interests, his intentions, I should say, were pretty unmistakable. He wanted Rome. The imperial defenses began to crumble, and Emperor Valentinian III retreated to Ravenna, leaving the city on its own. So, in the absence of all kinds of leadership, Leo stepped forward. Accompanied by a delegation that included the Roman Council, Leo traveled north to meet Attila. Their meeting, traditionally believed to have taken place near the Mincio River, which is close to Mantua, remains pretty cloaked in ambiguity. Contemporary records are sparse, and of course later accounts are often embellished. Yet all sources agree on one striking fact. Attila turned back. Why Attila chose to retreat remains completely debatable. Some scholars point to practical concerns such as disease, famine, or that he had overreached his supply lines. Others highlight Leo's diplomatic prowess and his moral authority. Now, according to the sort of spiritual reading of this is often very common. The story goes that as Leo walked up to meet Attila, he was accompanied by a vision of Saints Peter and Paul, both holding swords and threatening divine punishment on Attila if he proceeded. The truth, though, is elusive. All we know is that he turned back, and that Leo's role in averting disaster is obvious. So this encounter actually had immediate and lasting consequences. In the short term, Leo had saved Rome from destruction. He emerged as not only a religious leader, but now as a figure of political seriousness, substance, stepping into the void often left by imperial collapse. And his courage and spiritual leadership were lauded by all of his contemporaries. And this begins the long story, you might say, of the man who would become the first great pope, Leo the Great. But the peace was temporary. In 455, as I said, Rome faced another assault, this time by the Vandals, led by King Genseric. Now, the Vandals are actually a Germanic peoples who had established a powerful kingdom in North Africa. Yes, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it did for the time. And the Vandals crossed the Mediterranean and landed near the Tiber's mouth. And the Emperor Valentinian III had been assassinated earlier that year. Only one guess as to why. But again, political disarray was the norm. And once again, Leo took action. Though he could not prevent the sack, Leo went out and negotiated with Genseric at the gates of Rome, pleading for mercy. And according to the chronicles, Genseric agreed not to burn the city or slaughter the inhabitants, although he did proceed to loot the entire city over a period of 2 weeks. The devastation was, of course, severe. Sacred objects, treasures, works of art were all stolen. And there were many Romans who were enslaved. Yet Leo's intervention spared countless lives and preserved much of the city's infrastructure, which is still there today. So in the wake of these calamities, Leo intensified his efforts to strengthen the church. He preached repentance, saying that the invasions were divine chastisement for sin. He also took practical measures, rebuilding the church and lots of other church structures, helping victims, and ultimately consolidating church administration. And these crises shaped Leo's theological vision as well, In his sermons and letters, he always underscores the providential meaning of suffering and how Christians ought to endure in their faith amidst the collapse of the world around them. He always proclaimed a simple Christian hope that we ought not root our faith in earthly institutions, but in the eternal city of God. But Leo's confrontations with Attila and Genseric also underscore a deeper reality, which is that Rome is now transforming from an imperial capital to a spiritual stronghold. And to this day, we think of Rome, we think of Vatican, we think of Pope, or we think of old Roman rulers like Caesar. But today, we think of Rome, we think of it as a spiritual place. That happens under Leo. Because as the power vacuum of Roman leadership leaves and is destroyed, now the protector of the city is the Pope himself. And these confrontations ultimately signaled the close of one era and the dawn of another, in which the papacy would come to define leadership in the post-Roman West. And so we might say Leo is not merely responding to history, but he's helping shape its course. Leo died in 461, just 6 years after the Vandal sack. Yet his legacy endured. The image of Leo confronting barbarian kings is actually emblematic of the Pope's moral and spiritual authority. And in fact, in 1754, Pope Benedict XIV had Leo declared a doctor of the Church, recognizing not only his leadership, but his theological teachings as well. And so that is where we're going to turn now. Because while we've already described his greatness in leadership, it is actually his theological thinking that is some of the most interesting stuff from this time period as well. And so let's look at that. Okay, so we're going into Leo's theological importance. And I want to give you 3. There's a couple of others, but the last couple are minor, mostly related to Catholic social thought, which is very important. But I'm going to focus on his big 3. Now, it's interesting because the first one we're going to discuss, his Christology, is actually the least consequential of Leo's ideas. Now, I don't mean that they're inconsequential. I just mean that his other writings on papal authority and on grace and Pelagianism are far more consequential. As I'll say in a minute, Leo is very clear on Christology, but his ideas were not the ones that were being debated. He was more or less giving a Western Latin take on a conflict that was happening in the East, and even doing that, Leo himself got into a controversy for a minute. But at least for Western thinkers, Western writers, Leo's Christology is very, very important. Because what's about to happen is the East and West will divide in many ways, slowly, over the centuries. A lot of that is benign at first. It's just linguistically they're dividing. There are debates about papal authority versus how some in the East viewed authority as distributed amongst multiple patriarchs. But for the West, meaning most of you, Leo is often discussed as a big champion for Orthodox Christology. So let me explain why that is. Leo is known for contributing to the articulation of what is known as the hypostatic union, which is simply just the doctrine that in one person, Jesus Christ, there are 2 complete and unconfused natures, that they coexist. There's one person, Jesus Christ, but he is divine and human. Both natures exist. And this central tenet of Christian orthodoxy was already there in John 1. In the beginning was the Word was God, but was with God. He was with God in the beginning, and then later he came down. So this idea that the Word, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, is God, yet come down. And because of that, taking on of human flesh, it's one person, Jesus Christ, but we can distinguish and discuss his divine nature and his human nature in the same way that John 1 does. Now, that central idea, that central orthodoxy, was affirmed at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and Leo had a hand in those debates. Now, if I were to describe what is happening in a very simple layman's terms, what has happened is you might say some people are overthinking the question about how the human and divine natures in Jesus relate to each other. Now, these are important questions because the way we describe this, the way we try to explain this, If you explain it a little bit weird, or you explain it in a way that violates some other doctrines in Scripture, well, you have problems. And in a sense, that's what happens. You see, whenever human and divine meet in the person of Christ, we often say in theology that it is a mystery, which I used to always say in class, it just means you don't get to see the inside of it. You're describing this, you might say, phenomenologically. You're describing what you're seeing in the text. This man, Jesus, who eats, who sleeps, who walks, who bleeds, also is described as God himself tabernacling amongst us. Well, for some, they had to go on to try to figure out how. And again, I'm not going to get into all of this, but it essentially divides into two different directions in terms of extremes. One is a direction that sees that the divine simply swallows up the human nature. This is often called Eutychianism or Monophysitism. And it's this idea that, of course, the divine is so overwhelming that the human nature just basically ceases to exist. So in that sense, in that extreme, you have either his human nature is irrelevant, or it ceases really to exist at all. It's as if he's transfigured into some divine being at all times. Now, Leo goes after this the hardest, and he begins to describe Christology in very, very important ways that people in the West still do today. You see, what Leo noticed is that the language used back in the Nicene Creed, the Nicene-Constantinople Creed, that described the Son as fully God, of one substance with the Father, could also be used to clarify the way in which Jesus, the Son incarnate, is like us in every way. And so Leo often writes that Jesus is consubstantial with us in every way, or he is like us in every way. And as we'll see in a minute, Leo sees this as mostly a problem of our salvation. He's not just arguing about divine human natures. Leo will highlight this point repeatedly, and others do as well. I'm not saying Leo's the first, but he will do this very strongly. And he says that if Christ lacked true humanity, then the redemption of humanity would have been incomplete. You see, Jesus had to be like us in every way to take our place. And there's this old line from this time as well, used by another, which is that the unassumed is unhealed. Meaning, if you have Jesus walking around and he's 2/3 human, just to give a number, well, then you're 2/3 saved, would be the logic of what they're saying. He came down to take on our flesh, and if you go read Romans 5, where it talks about sin came by one man, Adam, now life, salvation has come by one man, Jesus, it is very clearly what Paul's doing there in Romans 5 is saying the human nature of Jesus matters if he's going to take our place, if he's going to die on our behalf. He can't be an angel. He can't be a sort of phantasm of what a human looks like, but it's really God pretending to be human. He has to actually, as I often say, bleed, defecate, and sleep to be like us in every way. And so Leo's Christology does a very careful balancing act here where he distinguishes between the human and divine natures, but he does a very strong move to preserve the unity of one person, Jesus Christ. He affirms, for example, that Christ's divine nature remains fully divine, and his human nature fully human. Each retains its properties, but is still one person. And he writes, quote, the distinction of natures being by no means taken away by the union, you can still tell the difference between human and divine natures, even though there's one person, but rather the property of each nature being preserved. So this might sound a little philosophical, but it's actually pastoral and soteriological. It's about your salvation. For Leo, the incarnation is essential to salvation. It was for all the church fathers. Modern theology, for whatever reason, has put Christology over on the left and salvation doctrines over on the right, but these actually work in orbit with one another. Because who Christ is what he came to do in Christian theology. He's not coming to just give some sermons and go away. He's coming to die on our behalf. So only someone who is both God and man can mediate between humanity and God. In his letter 35, Leo says, quote, the redemption of mankind required that the mediator between God and men should be both God and man. In another letter, letter 165, he says, quote, he who was impassible in his divine nature, not able to suffer, becomes passible, able to suffer in his human nature. He does this vivid language a lot. He who was invisible in his own nature became visible in ours. He who was incomprehensible became comprehensible. He who was before time began to exist in time. I'm reminded of some old thing from my childhood where there was a hymn of some kind, and it was during Christmas, and it talked about the baby in the manger holding on to mother's breast, while also in his divine nature keeping all of heaven and earth rotating and moving according to his will. That type of language. It is a mystery. It gives your mind a Charlie horse when you try to reckon with that complexity. But Leo loves this language, this very vivid language, very back and forth between distinguishing the natures, but it's still one person. All of Leo's language underscores the paradox without compromising clarity. Saying again in letter 31, the Lord Jesus Christ, born of the Virgin Mary, is true God and true man, consubstantial with the Father as to his divinity, consubstantial with us as to his humanity. You might call this a dual consubstantiality. That's a huge, nerdy word to say it, but that is exactly what he's pointing to here. And it's foundational for his understanding of the incarnation. Now, one thing to clarify just real quickly, often the way Chalcedon is described is that you have competing schools of thought. And let me just kind of clarify this. The two schools are said to be the Antiochian school, which emphasizes Christ's humanity. It's more Jewish. And then you have the Alexandrian school, which is Greek and focused on the divinity of Christ. You can't see my face right now, but I am eye-rolling. But what happens is you have this idea that there are these two schools of thought. They're just fighting it out. One only cares about the humanity, and one only cares about the divinity. And it's somehow this Greek versus Jewish fight. And that you have all these other many little councils that fight over these things. And then what happens is that Leo, it's often said, comes in and he kind of, like Solomon, splits the baby and gets them to compromise and come to a consensus of both and. Okay, first, there is no Antiochian school. Second, there is no Alexandrian school. Those are myths that were made up in the 1800s. It's an interpretive model by largely German scholars that love to see Jewish versus Greek thought as the great paradigm of the ancient world. None of the figures involved are thoroughly tied to either city. And in fact, the most consequential people, Cyril of Alexandria and St. John, don't fit either category as well. What's going on here? And I will just go ahead and stop and say, I do have a co-authored book on this, The Story of Creeds and Confessions. There's a whole chapter on this and the fight and everything I'm about to tell you, but I just want to clarify very quickly. What is happening in the East is a couple of things. Yes, you do have a couple of opinions that are very staunchly heretical, as it will come to be known. It's a denial of one of those two principles, either the divinity of Christ or the humanity in some way. A lot of what's happening, though, is in the East, the Greek language has not two words to describe the nature and person of Christ. It has three words, and the third word can shade as a synonym in either direction. So what you have a lot of is terminological fighting, where, as it will come to be known later, both sides in a couple of these debates are saying the same thing. They've just moved the synonym to one side or the other, and so they keep hearing the other side spouting something that's heretical, something like Jesus is two natures, two persons by accident. And so over a long and quite tortured series of events, you get to the Council of Chalcedon, where, finally, the terminological confusion is put to rest. Leo, believe it or not, had very little to do with the council, except when he sent his letter, his tome it's called, to the council. He, very briefly, was accused of heresy as well, because he was writing in Latin, and he was using language that sounded like, again, one of those shadings of synonyms to one side. It is complicated. I'm not going to go into all of it right now. I have other videos on this on the channel if you want to go a deep dive into all of the Christological fights. For now, you need to know that, one, this is not an Antiochian Alexandrian thing, and two, Leo is not the decider of the doctrine. He doesn't come in and, again, just sort of split the baby and bring both sides together and have this essentially a compromised document of the Chalcedonian Creed. but rather Leo, for the West, where Latin was already much more clear and polished on the subject, had already laid out a very, very healthy two natures, one person doctrine. And all the West, all the papal legates wanted, was to ensure that the East came to the same conclusion. And in the end, they did. All sides in general are happy, though there are some in the East that carried on grievances for the subject for a while. A lot of those grievances and fights have, by the way, largely diminished or even been done away with. But Leo's Christology is crystal clear and one of the most important theological works in the West. And for that, Leo is highly praised. While Christology controversies occupied a lot of Leo's energy leading up to the Council of Chalcedon, his opposition to Pelagianism reveals an actual deeper dimension of his thinking, the nature of divine grace. Second only to Augustine, Leo stands among the most forceful defenders of grace in the entire ancient church. His opponent was Pelagianism, a doctrine that essentially held that original sin was nothing, salvation could be attained through human will alone, without the assistance of divine grace. Now, Pelagianism had already been condemned at the Council of Carthage in 418, but it continued to exert influence, particularly through clergy who had quietly re-entered the church without renouncing their views. In his first letter, actually, that we have, Leo condemns this reintegration and demands public repudiation of Pelagian errors. He writes, quote, "Grace is to everyone the source of righteousness, the source of good, and the fountain of all merit." For Leo, grace is never the reward for good works. Never. It was the source of good works. All of the good works that come out of the Christian, therefore, are the gift of the Holy Spirit, so that no one can boast, right? Leo rests all of his thinking on this heavily on passages like Ephesians 2, 8-10, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. It is the gift of God." Leo always insists that Pelagianism of any kind, good works as reward of any kind, undermine the truth by making grace dependent on our effort. In so doing, it distorts the heart of the gospel. So Leo here is very concerned doctrinally and pastorally. Pelagianism, by denying the severity of original sin, rendered the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist less essential. Like Augustine, Leo saw this as spiritually perilous. And in the same letter, the first one, he demanded a synod in Aquileia, and that former Pelagians issue a public recantation. Here is the leadership and the doctrinal precision coming out. Quote, "Let them by their public confession condemn the authors of this presumptuous error and renounce all the universal church has repudiated in their doctrine." You see, Leo knew that often when you want to have a nice ecumenical spirit, you want to not sort of throw people out, not have orthodox standards, the easiest way to do that historically is you just fuzz up the language. You know, if doctrinal precision is needed and that divides and you can't be perhaps in the same church, well, if we just fuzz that up a little bit, well, hey, we're all cool, right? And Leo's having none of that. He's just like, nope, let them stand up and let them say that they reject Pelagianism. For Leo, to tolerate heresy, even if it's dormant, means that it could resurface. So therefore, he demands not only correction, but conformity. Now, on the doctrine itself, theologically, Leo affirms the prevenience of grace, meaning grace always comes first. So Leo here is strongly influenced by Augustine. You see it on every page. He has the same view across the board. But Leo does have a slightly distinct flavor to it. You see, Augustine often reflects on the inner psychology of grace. He sort of foreruns Luther in that sense. It's about the inner life, the inner turmoil, the struggle within. Leo emphasizes the public and you might call it the ecclesiastical or the church life that this implies. So in letter 124, he says, "Grace is not a reward but a gift, lest any man should boast. It is freely given of God." But he then goes on to say that the bulwark against this, that's holding back this Pelagianism, is the church, which brings you in and says you're a sinner, but you've been forgiven. Come partake in the sacraments. And he's very, very clear throughout his pontificate, telling bishops, quote, "You must take heed that no seed of the same evil of good works righteousness spring up in your province from a doctrine that has once been uprooted. Grace, he always says, flows through the sacraments, through the life of the church, through humble leadership and the preaching of the gospel. The church is not the gathering of the righteous or those who are trying to make themselves righteous. It is the appointed instrument of salvation as grace comes and rewards with a good Christian life. And so, on that issue, on grace and good works, Leo is, again, strongly Augustinian, very much one of the strongest defenders of grace alone you might find anywhere in the ancient church. Well, okay, if in that last section you thought I was trying to make Leo out to be a proto-Protestant, I'm about to burst your bubble. Let's talk about his understanding of papal primacy. On this issue, Leo is one of the strongest ancient figures to really develop a language and a theology of what we today call Petrine primacy, or the role of Peter and his successor, the Pope. Leo's vision of the church is rooted in his theological convictions, as I've always said, and he believes that the institution of the papacy is divinely founded and guided by apostolic authority, especially that of Peter. And it's all throughout his writings. He stands very tall on the question of the Petrine office, meaning the Peter office, in Rome, and that his successor, now called the Pope, is given the mantle of that same authority. So in letter 10, Leo writes, quote, "For the solidity of that faith, which was praised in the chief of the apostles, is perpetual." And he continues to go back to Matthew 16 over and over again. For Leo, the papacy is that office through which the authority of the apostles continues to speak. It's a mystical connection, he said, but it is a real one. Letter 14, he says, "The care of the universal church should converge towards Peter's one seat, and nothing anywhere should be separated from its head. The Bishop of Rome thus functions as the visible source of ecclesial unity." Obviously something we know very much today, but in his day, this is very much a development in terms of its strength of conviction. Now, of course, there is still time. A lot is going to develop, but eventually there will be papal universal jurisdiction established in the West. And you see this also in just the way Leo sends his letters out. He'll send a letter like an apostle to a location. Then he'll require that that letter be sent throughout all the churches of the region. For Leo, Rome's authority is universal. In his letter 104, he even goes on to say that because the Pope is to be the judge of the faith, he is not to be judged by those who are under his care. Sort of a papal immunity. And I will stop in to say, again, as an historian, this is a big step. It's not a giant step, but this idea that having stepped into that power vacuum, having leveraged his theological voice on a number of controversies, and now standing real big on this Petrine office, you can see why Leo across the board becomes known as the Great. He's not only a model of that type of leadership, but he's also giving a theology of how that leadership ought to continue and be understood within the confines of the church. More important, Leo's model of leadership is absolutely not authoritarian. And that actually, for me, increases my curiosity about our new Pope Leo, because he has been known for the same way, a very strong-willed, opinionated person, but a mediator, and not an authoritarian. Already in his short papacy, many people have noticed that as well. Leo doesn't come across as an authoritarian at all. First Leo was exactly like that as well. He reminds bishops in letter 120, "The bishops of the church must remember that they are set over the churches not to rule, but to serve." That pastoral perspective always tempers his claim to the authority and the office of the bishop, especially the Bishop of Rome. Now, I will say, for the sake of historical clarity, Leo's strong assertions were challenged. They met resistance in the East. The patriarchs of the East, and especially at the Council of Chalcedon itself, passed Canon 28, which elevated the status of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Leo firmly rejected that, arguing that it contradicted the primacy of Rome and Peter, and he is not happy with that at all. But, of course, in the West, this is going to become the norm, the papacy as we know it. And Leo really is, you might say, the start of, frankly, the medieval papacy. He might even be called the first medieval pope in some ways. I guess that depends on how you view the Middle Ages, as a good thing or as the Dark Ages. But his thought on the office of the Pope provided a theological framework that shaped the medieval papacy, and that continues to do so down to contemporary Catholic teachings on the office of the Pope. What distinguishes Leo, what made him great, was his integration of theology, pastoral care, and governance into a unified vision of the Christian faith. In all of those subjects, there might have been better people for the job. There were certainly more influential, more heavy-hitting theologians from the East on the subject of Christology. There were before, and there have been since, equally as good administrators over the papacy. And there have often been mediators in the role of Pope as well. What's interesting about Leo is he has all of these things in very much abundance, that the combination of them becomes quite striking. And as I said, Leo stands at the crossroads of patristic and medieval theology. Everything from his theology to his political leadership to even things like giving to the poor on fast days all draw their origins from Leo's pontificate. And Leo's influence will reach far beyond his lifetime. The medieval papacy, the development of canon law, and the structure of scholastic theology all bear his imprint. And as a bridge between the ancient church and the medieval era, Leo preserved the heritage of the faith while laying a groundwork for something that might be altogether new. Today, Leo is known as a unifier, someone who brought people together, and his singular place in history as the first great pope.